He missed his late wife every morning, until a little girl left a note. He still set out 2 mugs every morning, even though only one would be used. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Henry shuffled into the kitchen, wearing the same slippers his wife had bought him 3 Christmases ago. They were worn out, just like him, but he couldn't let them go. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from an old jar she used to keep near the stove. He never touched it, but he didn't throw it away either. He opened the cabinet and pulled out 2 ceramic mugs. One was plain black, chipped at the rim. The other was pale blue, with tiny yellow flowers painted around the handle. Margaret's favorite. Henry placed them both on the counter like he always did. Then he stood still for a moment, staring at them, his fingers resting on the edge of the counter. He took a slow breath, picked up only the black mug, and poured the coffee. The blue mug stayed empty. He sat at the small kitchen table where the morning sun spilled across the floor. Her chair was still pulled out, like she had just stepped away. Her glasses sat on the placemat. He couldn't bring himself to move them. 2 years. And still, it felt like she might walk in any minute, ask him why he looked so serious. Henry sipped his coffee and looked at the framed photo on the windowsill. It was Margaret, sitting in their garden, laughing at something he'd said. Her head tilted slightly back, mouth open, eyes closed the way she laughed when she was truly happy. That photo had become part of his morning. "Morning, love," he said softly. "Coffee's hot today. Just how you liked it." He waited. Of course, there was no answer. Sometimes he'd pretend she answered. In his head, he'd hear her say, "You made it too strong again, Henry." He'd smile, say something back, then sit in silence. He stayed at the table longer than necessary. He had nowhere to be. No one waiting for him. His days were like that now. Slow, quiet, heavy. By late morning, he'd walk down the block to the little park on the corner. It was their park. That's what he called it, even though hundreds of others walked through it every week. To him, it would always belong to the 2 of them. The same trees, the same cracked sidewalk, the same wooden bench near the pond. He and Margaret had picked that spot the first time they visited after moving into the neighborhood. She liked the sound of the ducks. He liked the way the sunlight hit the water around 11. Now he came alone. He sat in the middle of the bench and folded his hands on his lap. He looked around. A couple of joggers passed by. A woman with a stroller nodded at him. No one stopped. They never did. Just another old man sitting alone in a park. People meant well, but they didn't know what to say. That was okay. He didn't want to talk. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind in the trees. It wasn't the same without her. Nothing was. A breeze carried the faint scent of lilacs, Margaret's favorite flower. He opened his eyes and looked up at the branches overhead. No lilacs here. Just his memory playing tricks again. He checked his watch. It was nearly noon. Time to head home, make a sandwich, and wait for the day to end. That was life now. A series of habits without meaning. Henry stood, stretched his back, and turned to glance at the bench one last time before leaving. It was just a bench, but it held everything. He walked slowly back to his house. The front door creaked the way it always had. He stepped inside and stood in the doorway for a moment. Quiet. Still. He set his keys on the table, sat back down in the kitchen, and stared at the blue mug. He missed her. Every morning. And he thought that would never change. The sidewalk didn't crack overnight, but it felt deeper every morning he passed over it. Henry tugged his coat tighter around him as he stepped outside. The air had that dry chill that sneaks into your sleeves and settles into your bones. Across the street, sprinklers clicked on, spraying water over an empty lawn. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Nothing had changed. That was the problem. He moved slowly. His knees didn't work the way they used to, but it wasn't just age. It was the weight of walking alone. He made the same walk every day, right after breakfast. His feet followed the route out of habit, the corner where Margaret once twisted her ankle, the white fence they used to joke about repainting, the house with the wind chimes that always made her stop and listen. Every turn held a piece of her. And now each piece reminded him of what was gone. At the end of the block sat the park. It wasn't anything grand. A few benches, a pond, some swings for the kids. But to Henry, it was sacred ground. He stepped onto the gravel path, nodding politely at a man jogging with earbuds in. No one really looked at him. Not closely. Not the way Margaret used to. He walked to the far edge of the park, where the path curved and opened to a quiet clearing. That's where the bench sat, facing the pond, tucked beneath a maple tree. The same bench they had claimed as theirs. He lowered himself slowly onto the wood. It groaned under his weight, familiar now, like it recognized him. Henry glanced at the spot beside him. Her spot. She used to sit with one leg crossed over the other, hands resting in her lap. He could still picture her there, cardigan draped over her shoulders, eyes scanning the water. "You'd say it's too cold to be sitting out," he muttered, glancing at the sky. "But you'd stay anyway, just to watch the ducks." There were a few ducks today, not many. The pond had thinned out since the summer. He watched one dip its head beneath the water, then flap its wings and glide away. Margaret used to name them. "That one looks like a Roger," she'd say. "Definitely a Roger." Henry smiled faintly, but it faded as quickly as it came. The silence pressed in again. He wasn't afraid of being alone, but being forgotten. That was different. He hadn't spoken more than a few sentences to anyone in days. The grocery clerk had asked if he wanted paper or plastic. That was about it. People assumed old folks liked solitude. He didn't. He liked Margaret. There was a difference. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He stayed like that for a while, just listening. There was something about this park. Even now, with the laughter of kids in the distance and the occasional rustle of wind, it felt like the only place in the world that still held her. He stayed longer than usual that morning. The sun was higher than it should have been when he finally stood up. His body protested, stiff from sitting too long. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. It was small, folded, tucked beneath the edge of the bench. For a second he thought it was just a wrapper or some trash. But no, it was a piece of paper, carefully placed. Henry bent down and picked it up. There was handwriting on it, uneven, large, and clearly written by a child. He unfolded it slowly, unsure of what he was even doing. The note read, "I see you here every day. Are you okay?" No name, no date, just that. Henry stared at it for a long time. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, but not from the wind. Someone had noticed him. Not just seen him, but noticed. He folded the note gently and placed it in his coat pocket. He didn't know who had left it. But for the first time in a long time, something in his chest shifted. Not quite joy. Not yet. But it wasn't sadness either. As he walked home, he reached into his pocket and touched the note again. Maybe tomorrow wouldn't be the same. Henry barely slept that night. He lay in bed with the note on his nightstand, reading it over and over like it might change. He had a dozen questions and no answers. Who was this child? How long had they been watching him? Why would they care? But it wasn't the mystery that kept him awake. It was the feeling he hadn't known he missed. Being seen. Not pitied. Not passed by. Seen. Morning came early, as it always did. The house woke up cold and quiet, the way it always had since Margaret was gone. Henry made his coffee and set out the blue mug again, even though it stayed empty. He didn't talk to the photo that morning. He just looked at it and nodded, as if Margaret somehow already knew. Henry walked to the park earlier than usual. The air was damp, and the sky hung low with gray clouds. But he didn't care about the weather today. He carried a small sheet of lined paper in his coat pocket, along with a pen. When he reached the bench, he checked the ground, the trees, the surrounding path. No sign of anyone watching. He sat and unfolded the page he brought. His handwriting was slow, careful. It had been years since he'd written anything by hand that wasn't a grocery list or a date on the calendar. I miss someone very much. Thank you for asking. Henry. He looked at the message for a long moment before folding it neatly. He tucked it under the same edge of the bench where the first note had been left. And then he waited. He stayed on the bench for nearly an hour, hoping he might catch a glimpse of someone. A child peeking from behind a tree. Maybe a curious face from the path. But there was nothing. Just passing strangers and birds overhead. Eventually, he stood and walked home. He kept glancing over his shoulder, like the sender might suddenly appear, but the path stayed empty. That night, the note was all he could think about. He pulled it from his coat pocket and read it again. Are you okay? It wasn't much, but it had weight. More than most people said to him in months. He found himself hoping for something he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. A second note. The next morning, he didn't hesitate. He shaved, changed into a nicer sweater, and was out the door before 9. The park was quiet again, the way he liked it. The ducks moved lazily through the water, and the bench looked untouched. But as he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. There it was. Another folded paper, sitting exactly where his had been. Henry sat down, picked it up, and unfolded it with hands that trembled, not from age, but from something that felt strangely like anticipation. I'm sorry you miss someone. I miss someone too. My grandpa died last year. I still talk to him sometimes. Your friend. No name, just your friend. Henry blinked hard, staring at the words. His eyes stung, and he didn't bother hiding it. There was something about the handwriting, the backwards S, the uneven spacing, that made it feel even more honest. He read the note again, and then again. It wasn't just kindness. It was shared grief. Whoever this child was, they weren't reaching out with empty sympathy. They understood. Henry folded the paper and placed it in his inside coat pocket, where it felt safest. He pulled out his pen and scribbled quickly on the back of the note he'd left yesterday. Thank you for writing to me again. I talk to my wife sometimes, too. Her name was Margaret. She had the best laugh in the world. He paused, then added, It's nice to have a friend, even a secret one. He placed it under the bench once more, smoothing it flat so it wouldn't blow away. As he walked home, something felt lighter in his chest. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. But it was something close. And for the first time in years, Henry found himself looking forward to tomorrow. Henry woke up with purpose. He didn't linger in bed staring at the ceiling like he usually did. Instead, he pushed himself up, reached for his slippers, and moved through his morning like someone who had somewhere to be. The house still felt quiet, still empty, but it didn't press down on him the same way it had before. There was something waiting for him now, a reason to return to that bench. He skipped setting out the second coffee mug, not because he was ready to let go of the ritual, but because he didn't need it this morning. Margaret would understand. Henry took his time walking to the park. His joints didn't move any faster, but there was a new rhythm in his steps. At the corner, he paused and looked up at the trees lining the street. The leaves had started to change. Gold and amber flickered in the morning light. He hadn't noticed yesterday. When he reached the bench, his eyes immediately dropped to the wooden slats and the dirt beneath it. He scanned the ground, heart ticking faster than it had in months. And there it was, a small square of white paper, folded twice, tucked neatly under the bench leg, just like before. He eased down onto the seat, his bones protesting less today, and picked up the note with both hands. The childlike handwriting greeted him with something new. "Margaret sounds nice. I'm glad you had someone like that. I think Grandpa would have liked her too. Do you still go places you used to go with her? Your friend." Henry smiled quietly to himself. The note was so simple, but the question was real. No one had asked him something like that in years. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pen and a fresh slip of paper, and rested it on his knee to write. "Yes, I do. This bench was our spot. We came here almost every morning before her illness. She liked feeding the ducks. Sometimes she brought old bread in her purse. I told her not to, but she always did anyway. Now I come here because it still feels like she's close." He stopped, then flipped the page to continue. "Tell me more about your grandpa. What did you like to do together?" He signed it again. Henry. There was a warmth in writing that he hadn't felt in years. He'd forgotten how much a piece of paper could carry, how words, even simple ones, could pull two people together. He slid the note under the bench just like before, pressing it flat against the dirt. Then he stayed seated, watching the trees sway and a squirrel scurry by with something in its mouth. Across the path, a mother with a young child passed by. The little girl looked over at him, then back at her mom. It wasn't her, he thought. Probably too young. But he found himself watching anyway. He stayed longer than usual. Something about today made him want to soak in the moment, as if leaving too quickly might chase it away. When he finally stood up to go, he noticed something strange for the first time. He didn't feel heavy. His legs still ached. His steps were still slow. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't dragging the weight of the morning with him. He wasn't going back to the house to just sit and wait. He was returning to write again tomorrow. That night, Henry set the note from the child beside the others in a small wooden box he kept in his bedroom drawer. It used to hold Margaret's earrings. He hadn't touched it in a long time. But now it had a new purpose. Before turning off the light, he looked at the newest note again. There was something incredible about being asked a real question, and something even more powerful in wanting to answer it. Henry didn't need a calendar to know how many days had passed. He measured time differently now. 3 notes exchanged, 4 walks to the park, 5 mornings with a reason to get out of bed. The bench had become more than a place to sit. It was a thread between 2 strangers, one old, one young, who somehow understood each other without ever meeting. And that quiet understanding gave his days a new shape. The morning was crisp, the sky a soft gray that held back the sun. Henry wore a scarf today. Margaret had knitted it years ago, burgundy with thin gray stripes. He used to keep it in the drawer, untouched. Today, it felt right. He reached the bench and sat with a soft sigh. His knees protested less when he lowered himself slowly, something he'd learned over time. The wood felt cool beneath him, smooth in the places he'd touched most. He looked down. Another note, folded neatly, just like always. This one was slipped a little deeper beneath the bench, like someone had taken extra care to hide it from the wind. Henry picked it up, unfolded it, and smiled before he even read the first word. "Hi, Henry. I liked reading about Margaret. I didn't know ducks weren't supposed to eat bread. Grandpa used to feed pigeons. Sometimes we'd go to the corner store and buy sunflower seeds just for them. He always said they had more sense than people. I'm glad you still go to your favorite place. I still sit on Grandpa's old chair sometimes. It creaks a lot, but it makes me feel like he's still near." "Do you ever talk to her out loud?" "I do that with Grandpa." It ended like the others. "Your friend." Henry folded the note gently and rested it on his lap. The writing was messier this time, a few smudges along the edges, but it was still careful, still full of thought. He didn't know how old this child was, 8, maybe 9, but the words were mature in a way that only loss can teach. He pulled a fresh page from his coat pocket and began writing, more quickly now, like the words were finally flowing freely. "Yes, I talk to her all the time, mostly in the kitchen, sometimes here on the bench. I don't always say much, just small things, what the weather's like, what I had for breakfast. But I think she would have liked that. Margaret used to say love stays in the little things. I think your grandpa would agree with her. He sounds like a smart man." Henry paused. Then he added another sentence. "It helps to know you talk to your grandpa, too. Makes me feel a little less odd." He hesitated before adding, "What do your parents think of your letters? Do they know you write to me?" It wasn't meant to scare the child off. He just wanted to understand. Why this bench? Why him? He signed it the same way. "Henry." He bent to place the note under the bench again, smoothing the dirt so it would stay put. Then he sat back and watched the pond, the same way he used to when Margaret sat beside him. The ducks were louder today, quacking at each other and dipping under the water in quick little dives. Henry chuckled softly. "She always picked the loudest one and said that was me," he said under his breath. "Said I like to talk more than listen." A couple passed by, holding hands. Young, maybe 30. They smiled at him. He nodded back, and for once the gesture didn't feel hollow. Henry stayed until the wind picked up and the leaves rustled above him. Then he stood, a little slower than usual, but not reluctant. The walk home felt lighter again. Inside, he placed the latest note in the wooden box. It was starting to look full now. 5 pieces of paper folded neatly and placed with care. He closed the lid and rested his hand on top of it. Margaret would have liked this. Not just the letters, but what they brought out in him. He'd started answering questions again, and not just the ones written on paper, the quiet ones he'd ignored for too long. And every answer made him feel just a little more alive. Henry arrived at the park a little earlier than usual. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the tops of the trees, and the dew still clung to the grass. A low mist hovered above the pond, catching the light in thin silver strands. It was the kind of morning Margaret would have called quiet gold. He walked with careful steps, slower than he wanted, not because of pain, but because of anticipation. For days now, he and the child, his mysterious friend, had traded notes like tiny lifelines. Words folded and tucked beneath a bench had become the most honest conversations he'd had in years. Today, he had brought something different. A small photo of Margaret, the same one he kept in the kitchen. He had printed a copy at the drugstore and slid it into an envelope along with his latest letter. He reached the bench, heart lightly tapping in his chest, and bent down to place the envelope just as he always did. But then he paused. There was movement nearby, small, uncertain, and unfamiliar. Across the path, standing just behind a tree, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 9. Thin arms folded tightly in front of her, wearing a red hoodie and jeans with a tear at the knee. She was watching him. Their eyes met. She stepped out slowly. "Are you Henry?" she asked. The voice matched the handwriting, that slight, careful tone that came through in every letter. Henry blinked. He hadn't expected this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Yes," he said gently. "I am." She took another step forward, her shoes scuffed against the gravel. "I'm Lily," she said. "I'm the one who left the notes." Henry smiled, not with surprise, but with something deeper. Recognition. "Hello, Lily. I've been wondering if we'd ever meet." Lily stood still for a moment, like she wasn't sure if she should keep going. Then she sat down beside him, just far enough not to touch, but close enough to share the bench. There was silence at first, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I almost didn't come today," she said. "I thought maybe you'd be scared or mad that it was me." "I'm not mad," Henry said, "and I'm certainly not scared. I'm just grateful. You've been a light in my mornings." She looked at the pond, then down at her hands. "I didn't tell my parents at first," she said. "But then I did. I showed them your notes. My mom said it was okay. She said you seemed kind." Henry nodded. "She sounds like a wise woman." Lily smiled just slightly. "She says Grandpa would have liked you." Henry reached into his coat and handed her the envelope. "This is for you," he said. "There's a picture of Margaret inside. I wanted you to see the laugh I always talk about." Lily took it gently, holding the envelope like it might break. She opened it slowly and pulled out the photo. "She looks nice," Lily said after a moment. "Like someone who makes good cookies." Henry chuckled, a full, warm sound. She did. Chocolate chip. No one ever made them the way she did. Lily looked at the photo again, then handed it back, but Henry shook his head. "You keep it. I want her to meet my friend." She tucked it into her backpack without saying a word. They sat together for a long time, just watching the ducks. No notes, no paper between them. Just the kind of quiet where everything that needs to be said is already understood. Henry finally spoke. "You know, I haven't shared her laugh with anyone in a long time." "I'm glad you did," Lily said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Henry didn't just feel seen, he felt understood. They didn't talk much after that, but it didn't matter. They shared the bench, the space, and the weight of memories neither one could fully explain. And somehow, that made the morning lighter than any before. Henry returned to the park the next morning, uncertain if Lily would come again. The meeting had caught him off guard. After all the weeks of exchanging folded pieces of paper, he'd begun to imagine Lily as a kind of idea, gentle, thoughtful, anonymous. But yesterday, she became real. A child with sharp eyes, a soft voice, and a quiet presence that reminded him, unsettlingly, of Margaret. Not in how she looked, but in how she listened. He sat down on the bench, still warmed slightly by the morning sun. His hand rested on the wood beside him, where she'd sat the day before. For a few minutes, he told himself he was content either way. If she came, he'd be glad. If she didn't, he'd understand. But then he heard footsteps, small ones, unhurried. Lily appeared with a sketchbook under one arm and a juice box in her other hand. "You came back," Henry said. She nodded and sat beside him without a word, pulling her legs up onto the bench and crossing them beneath her. She opened her sketchbook in her lap and began flipping through pages. He watched her with quiet curiosity. "I like to draw sometimes," she said, not looking up. May I see?" She paused, then turned the book toward him. The drawings weren't perfect, but they were honest. There were trees, birds, what looked like a school playground. And then, on the third page, a picture of a woman holding a coffee mug, standing beside a man in slippers. The lines were simple, but he recognized it instantly. "That's Margaret," Henry said softly. "And me." "I tried to remember what you said about her," Lily replied. "The blue mug, the cinnamon jar. I guessed on the hair." "You guessed right," he said, still staring at the page. "She always had that little curl near her temple. It never stayed pinned." Lily smiled. They fell into a rhythm. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Henry told stories. Small ones, usually, about the way Margaret used to hum while she watered the garden, or how she cheated at Scrabble by claiming made-up words. Lily laughed at those, and when she didn't laugh, she listened with such focus that it made Henry feel like what he remembered actually mattered. Lily told him things too, about school, her hamster, Buttons, who bit her brother but never her, about her grandpa who used to whistle while he drove and let her ride up front even when her mom said no. "He said the front seat is for people who tell good stories," she said. "Then I imagine he let you up there often," Henry said. She looked down at her sketchbook. "Sometimes I forget what his voice sounded like. It's been a year, but it feels longer." Henry took a breath. "It's the same with Margaret. Some days I hear her clearly, like she just stepped out of the room. Other days, I can't quite remember how she said my name, and that scares me." They both sat quietly with that. A stillness passed between them that wasn't awkward. It was honest. "You ever cry?" Lily asked suddenly. Henry looked at her, surprised by the question. "Yes," he said. "Still do. Usually when I least expect it. Once it happened in the cereal aisle. Just hit me out of nowhere." Lily nodded. "Me too. Mine was during math class. They made us do word problems. One of them said, 'If Grandpa has 5 apples and gives away 3, and I couldn't even finish it." Henry nodded slowly. Sometimes numbers know exactly where to hurt. That made her smile. They stayed until the sun shifted high above the trees. Lily packed up her sketchbook, and Henry stood, more steady today than usual. As they walked toward the path together, Lily asked, "Can I come back tomorrow?" Henry looked down at her, the girl who had written him a note before knowing his name, who had sat in silence beside his grief and never tried to fix it. "I'd like that very much," he said. And with that, they parted ways. Not as strangers, not as pen pals, but as two people who had found something quietly extraordinary on an old wooden bench between shared memories and the soft sound of ducks in the distance. The blue mug stayed in the cabinet now, not because Henry had forgotten it, but because he didn't need the ritual anymore to remember Margaret. Her memory had started to live in new places, in drawings, in shared laughter, in small conversations on a park bench that had slowly become something sacred again. Each morning, Henry still made his coffee, still looked at her photo on the windowsill, but he didn't talk to it like he used to. Not because he missed her any less, but because lately, someone else had been listening too. Lily came to the park almost every day now. Sometimes she arrived before him, sitting cross-legged with her sketchbook in her lap, the edges worn from use. Other times, he was already there, warming the bench for both of them, watching the ducks, and wondering what new story she'd bring with her. Their routine wasn't complicated, but it meant everything. She often brought snacks, juice boxes, granola bars, once even a container of grapes she claimed she washed herself. Henry brought extra napkins and a thermos of tea, just in case she wanted to try something different than her usual apple juice. One morning, he brought a photo album, and they flipped through it together, page by page. "This one's our wedding," he had said, pointing to a faded picture. "Margaret made her own bouquet. Said store-bought flowers were too stiff." "She looked so happy," Lily had whispered. "She was, especially that day." Lily didn't ask many questions, but the ones she did ask were always thoughtful. What color were her eyes? What made her laugh the most? Did she ever get mad at you? Henry answered honestly. He told her Margaret's eyes were green like old glass bottles, that she laughed at her own bad jokes, and that once she got mad at him for throwing out a sweater she'd worn since college. It had a hole in the sleeve, but she said it still had one good hug left in it. "I would have kept it too," Lily had said. Their friendship had become something simple and steady. No declarations, no promises, just two people showing up for each other. And in showing up, Henry began to feel something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. One morning, Lily arrived carrying a book. "It's for you," she said. "You don't have to keep it, but it reminded me of the stories you tell." He turned it over in his hands. A children's book, gently worn. The cover showed an old man and a little girl sitting on a bench under a tree. Henry smiled. "I think I'll read it tonight," he said. They sat in their usual way, her sketching, him sipping tea. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But always, there was a quiet connection between them, like they both understood what it meant to carry love in memory. A light breeze picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. "You know," Henry said, "Margaret used to say silence could be full if you shared it with the right person." Lily nodded, not looking up from her drawing. "I think she was right." He watched her for a moment, her pencil scratching gently against the page. "What are you working on today?" She turned the sketchbook toward him. It was a picture of the bench, the two of them on it. He wore his scarf. She held a juice box. The ducks were in the background, and above them, leaves fell from the trees. Henry stared at it for a long time. "I love it," he said. "Thank you." She smiled, not shyly, but with a kind of quiet pride. When the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Lily packed her things. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." As she walked away, Henry sat for a while longer, the drawing still open in his hands. He looked out at the pond, where the ducks drifted across the water. For years, he had come to this bench out of habit, out of grief, out of longing. Now he came because someone was waiting, and that made all the difference. The morning started the way it always did. Henry made his coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the photo of Margaret on the windowsill. The light coming through the glass touched her smile in the same soft way it had for years. He still missed her. He always would. But the ache had changed. It had become quieter, less sharp. Something more like a presence than a wound. He didn't set out the blue mug anymore, but he didn't hide it either. It stayed right where it belonged, waiting without pressure. Outside, the sun was already warming the pavement. Summer was creeping in at the edges of spring. Henry pulled on his cardigan and slipped the small wooden box into his bag. It held every note Lily had written, every message, every folded square of kindness that had brought him back to life. At the park, the bench waited like it always did, steady, worn, familiar. The pond shimmered, ducks cut slow paths through the water, and tree branches swayed in a soft breeze. It was quiet, until he heard the now familiar footsteps. Lily appeared with her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, and something clutched in her hands. She walked up to him with that same steady calm she always had. "Hi, Henry." "Good morning," he said, smiling. "I made something," she said, holding out a folded piece of paper. "It's not a note exactly. It's for Margaret." He reached out and took it from her gently. "For Margaret?" he asked, surprised. Lily nodded. "I know she's not here, but I just wanted to say something to her." Henry unfolded the paper slowly, his hands suddenly careful in a way they hadn't been in years. The message was short, a child's handwriting, curved letters, a few crossed-out words, but the heart in it was unmistakable. "Dear Margaret, your husband is really nice. He misses you a lot, but I think you already know that. I just wanted you to know he's not alone. I sit with him sometimes. I like listening to his stories. He loves you so much. Love, Lily." Henry's breath caught in his chest. He stared at the paper, then at Lily. "May I keep this?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges. "Of course," she said. "It's yours." He folded the note and slid it into the wooden box with the others. Then he set the box beside him on the bench, resting his hand gently on top of it. "I think Margaret would have liked you very much," he said. "She always had a soft spot for people who noticed the quiet things." Lily looked out at the pond. "I think she's still here. Not in a ghost way or anything. Just here. Because you remember her so well." Henry nodded. He didn't need to speak. Some truths didn't need words. They sat like that for a while. A breeze stirred the leaves. Ducks floated closer to the shore. In the distance, a dog barked and a child laughed. Eventually, Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out her sketchbook. She opened to a fresh page and began to draw. Henry didn't ask what it was. He just watched her pencil move, steady and sure. As she sketched, he opened the wooden box and looked at the notes inside. 10 in total. 10 quiet exchanges that had stitched something back together inside him. One of the notes, the first one, was now slightly torn at the edge. The pencil faded, but he could still read the words. "I see you here every day. Are you okay?" He traced the letters with his thumb and smiled. Yes, he thought. He was okay now. Lily looked up from her sketchbook. "Do you think you'll ever stop coming here?" Henry glanced around at the trees, the bench, the pond, the soft echoes of memory. "No," he said. "I think this place still has more to say." She smiled and kept drawing. And so they sat, an old man, a young girl, and a small wooden box full of paper and heart, beneath the trees where love hadn't ended. It had simply found a new way to be seen. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.